Steam curled from the metal cup like a ghost rising. Lieutenant Goro Sakamoto didn't blink as he stared at it, unmoving on the wooden crate he used as a table. The warm liquid inside shimmered faintly under the single hanging bulb of the barracks, white, sweet-smelling, still untouched. Outside, snowmelt trickled through the red Utah soil, but inside Barracks 4A, silence gripped every man like frostbite. Earlier that morning, 2 American guards had wheeled in insulated drums, their metal sides dented from transport, condensation trailing down like sweat on skin. One of them, Sergeant Billy Harrow, grinned as he slapped the top of the drum and called out, "Courtesy of the Red Cross. Sweetened milk, boys. Twice a week now. Don't say we never treat you right." No one moved. Goro had stood at the front of the line as always, his back straight despite the ache in his joints. He hadn't spoken, only nodded once, sharply, and the others fell back as one, silent, coordinated, like soldiers on a parade field. It was a message. Refuse it. He turned away from the steaming ladle without a word, his face unreadable, but his message was louder than any shout. The others followed his lead. Not a single cup was filled. Now, the officers' quarters stank of barley gruel and dust, but all anyone could smell was the milk. Goro's thoughts churned as he sat at the edge of his bunk. This wasn't just about a drink. This was something else, something deeper, a test wrapped in warmth. He remembered Guadalcanal, how enemy leaflets had been dropped over jungle positions offering chocolate and food if they surrendered. How the first man who crossed over returned a week later, mouth sewn shut, fingers missing. Mercy, they had said. Goro knew better. Now, in a camp halfway across the world, the tactics hadn't changed, only the packaging. This was not kindness. This was softening, undermining resolve through sweetness. Pasteurized, sweetened, he read aloud from the label on the drum earlier in a flat voice. Private Tetsuya, sitting across the room polishing his boots, didn't look up. "What does that mean, sir?" "It means they wish to feed our tongues before they touch our minds." He placed his hand gently on the cup. It was still warm, not scalding, not cold, just warm enough to feel like an offer disguised as mercy. Across the compound, one of the guards slammed a barracks door with a clang, followed by muffled laughter. "You'd think we offered them poison," another voice barked out. "They're scared of milk," a third voice mocked, cracking into a bray of laughter that carried across the yard like a taunt. Goro's jaw tightened, not at the insult, but at the simplicity of it. They didn't understand. How could they? He stood slowly, walked to the small window, and looked out over the fenced horizon, barbed wire glinting in the afternoon sun, pine shadows draping across the red clay. His homeland lay beyond those mountains, impossibly far, stained in fire and fog. There, no one drank milk from metal drums. There, offerings came with obligation, gifts from enemies, doubly so. Inside, the barracks stirred slightly. Someone coughed. Another shifted in his bunk, the creak of wood echoing like distant thunder. Goro turned back to the cup and sat again, watching the steam. In its lazy drift, he saw memories. Rice fields, his younger brother laughing in spring rain, his father's stern voice reminding him that a soldier's duty was not only to live, but to endure without shame. He picked up the cup but did not drink. Instead, he placed it in the center of the room, where all could see. A statement. A warning. That night, no man in Barracks 4A touched the milk. Some looked long at their cups, others whispered, and one, young Minami, cried softly under his blanket, not from hunger, but from confusion. Goro heard him, but said nothing. Across the wire fence in the American administration hut, a fresh memo from the War Department sat unfolded on Camp Director Edward Lyman's desk. Initiate Phase 2 of Nutritional Morale Program. Sweetened dairy rations introduced to promote psychological comfort and cooperation. Field reports, optimistic Lyman scratched his head, glanced toward the unclaimed drums, and muttered, "Comfort, huh?" You try explaining milk to men who flinch at the color white. No one in Washington would hear that sentence. Back in the barracks, Goro remained awake, still seated, watching the steam fade. A gust of mountain wind rattled the wooden walls. He didn't move. He didn't need to. By morning, the milk was cold. He gently slid the cup aside and whispered, not in anger, but in finality, more to the empty air than to anyone near. Not everything offered by a smiling hand is meant for peace. Tell them the milk is good. The sentence fell like a weight into the silence of the barracks. Corporal Jinro Fushida stood frozen at the edge of the mess hall, his fingers curling slightly as he registered the order. The American sergeant who'd spoken was already walking away, muttering to another guard about how even the cows back home would take it. The milk, still warm, still sweet, still untouched, waited in gleaming metal drums just outside the kitchen. Jinro turned and walked back across the gravel path that split the camp in half, the winter sun flattening his shadow as he moved. His face, pale and thin, gave away little, but inside his mind churned like the engines of the ships he once catalogued in the Nagasaki docks. He had been a record keeper then, fluent in English, meticulous in detail, invisible to everyone until the draft came. Now, he was the only bridge between two sides that neither trusted nor understood one another. The prisoners had gathered already inside Barracks C, seated on their straw mats in tense silence. Lieutenant Goro Sakamoto stood near the wall, arms folded across his chest, his dark eyes already fixed on Jinro. Did they say something? Goro's voice was low, almost conversational, but there was an edge to it, a calm that warned of what lay underneath. They want us to drink, Jinro replied, careful with his words. They say it's safe. A murmur rippled through the room, short, clipped, disbelieving. The milk had become more than milk now. It was a symbol, a test, an offering too generous to be trusted. They say, Goro echoed, stepping forward. And you believe them? Jinro hesitated. That one beat of silence was enough. No, he answered finally, but they want you to believe them. That night, Jinro sat alone near the edge of the compound, staring at the glow from the officers' quarters beyond the wire fence. From the open kitchen door, the scent of warm milk drifted across the cold air, thick, sweet, clinging to his nostrils. He was hungry, yes, but it wasn't that kind of hunger that gnawed at him. It was the kind that came from being split in two. He had to know. He waited until lights dimmed, until footsteps faded. Then he walked quietly to the rear of the mess hall, where a small pitcher had been left behind for the guard's midnight shift. Jinro checked the alley behind him, then carefully poured a small cup from the ceramic spout. The metal was still warm in his hands. He lifted it slowly. The first sip hit like betrayal. Not because it was bad, on the contrary, it was sweet, even soothing. It tasted like something served at festivals, like condensed milk poured over rice on cold mornings. For a moment, it transported him, not to home, but to the idea of home, one unshaped by war. Then came the dread. He hadn't told anyone. No one had seen. But now, what? Jinro wiped his mouth with his sleeve, cleaned the cup, and disappeared back into the shadows of the barracks. That night, he did not sleep. He watched the ceiling with open eyes, the taste still coating his tongue like a secret he didn't ask to keep. The next morning, Lieutenant Goro approached him as they scrubbed laundry in the frost-lined troughs. "Did you drink it?" Goro asked flatly, not even glancing at him. Jinro gripped the brush tighter, staring at the soapy cloth in his hands. His voice came out hoarse. "No," he said. And that was the end of it, at least on the surface. The lie spread through him like a second warmth, but not the comforting kind. It clung heavier than the truth, heavier even than fear. He stood among the men during morning roll call, shoulders squared, face expressionless, and felt like a ghost among flesh. That week, the guards grew restless. They started calling the barrels Emperor's Tears, chuckling among themselves when none of the prisoners approached. One guard even offered a toast with his own cup and spat theatrically into the dirt when no one responded. Jinro said nothing. He merely translated orders, nodded politely, and kept the lie tucked behind his ribs like a hidden knife. Camp Director Edward Lyman noted the problem in his logbook. Persistent refusal of milk program. No religious contact available. Possibly psychological resistance due to propaganda or honor code. He underlined the phrase but never sent it up the chain. One night, Jinro found himself standing again by the milk drum, alone. He did not touch it this time. He simply stared, unsure if he wanted to taste it again or spit it back into the earth. That evening, a younger prisoner approached him, Private Kenshiro, barely old enough to shave. "Corporal Fushida," the boy whispered, "is it true?" "They say the milk is safe." Jinro looked at him. This boy who'd lost a brother to a submarine explosion, who still slept with fists clenched even in dreams. He opened his mouth to speak, and then closed it. "There is no such thing as safe," he said finally. "Only what you're willing to live with." He turned and walked away before Kenshiro could ask again. That night, he dreamed of his younger self, sitting at a school desk, reciting English vocabulary, unaware of the war inching closer like a rising tide. In the dream, someone handed him a glass of milk. He woke before he drank it. In the days that followed, no one drank. The barrels remained full. The guards laughed. The reports went quiet. And Jinro, who had swallowed the truth, now found himself starving for something he could never name. Sometimes he looked at the others and wondered if they could taste the lie in him, like smoke on the wind. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and cast long shadows across the compound, Goro sat beside him near the barracks window. The older man didn't speak at first, only watched the steam rise from a pot of boiled barley. Then, without looking at Jinro, he asked once more, "Did you try it?" Jinro's lips parted slightly, then closed. He stared ahead, watching the steam coil upward like the smoke of an extinguished fire. He shook his head. The silence between them stretched like wire under strain. The guilt pressed deeper, and the milk never left his stomach. Sometimes, the weight of loyalty is measured by what we refuse to swallow. The barrel fell with a hollow metallic crash. It struck the edge of the supply cart, tilted unnaturally, then tipped fully onto its side. A split second later, the sealed lid popped open with a slosh, and warm, pale milk spilled across the hard-packed earth like smoke turned liquid. The white stream fanned outward in erratic fingers, flooding the dirt between the boots of stunned guards and motionless prisoners. For a moment, no one moved. The air held still, thick with the scent of sun-warmed iron and sweet dairy, and something else. Fear. The prisoners nearest the spill stepped back instinctively, their faces contorting in dread as if the milk were acid. One man muttered a prayer under his breath. Another crossed his arms tightly, eyes wide with disbelief. Whispers flickered from mouth to mouth in sharp syllables. Yudan suruna, trapda. Don't be careless. It's a trap. The ground, saturated in white, might as well have been soaked in blood. Then, without warning, Private Saburo Minami dropped to his knees. His hands struck the wet dirt with a faint slap. At just 17, Saburo was the youngest among them, a boy with knobby elbows, sunken cheeks, and a hollow in his voice where hope had once lived. For days, he'd walked like a shadow, the heat and hunger leaching color from his skin. But now, something primal overtook him. He leaned forward and began scooping the milk with his bare hands, cupping it desperately to his lips. The warmth hit his tongue like fire and sugar and shame. "No!" a prisoner barked from behind him, reaching out too late. Saburo kept drinking, frantic and breathless, milk dripping from his chin, mixing with the grit in the soil. The guards shouted and converged. One of them barked something in English, waving his baton, while another laughed under his breath. "Look at him," the guard sneered. "Guess the Emperor's tears taste better than rice dust." Then Saburo coughed once, hard. He doubled over, his thin frame racked by a sudden spasm. The second cough choked halfway up his throat, followed by a dry gag. His body twisted sideways. He collapsed. A guard stepped back, startled. The laughter died. A few prisoners rushed forward, ignoring the shouts from the guards. They lifted Saburo's limp form and carried him across the yard. His eyes fluttered erratically. One arm hung loose, dragging through the spilled milk as they moved. By the time they reached the barracks, his skin was burning. "Bring water," one man urged. Another soaked a rag and pressed it to Saburo's lips. His teeth clenched. A murmur rippled across the room as someone whispered the unspoken, "He's been poisoned." Lieutenant Goro Sakamoto arrived moments later. He stood silently at the edge of the room, arms folded, eyes unreadable. When the others stepped aside, he knelt beside Saburo and took the rag from the man holding it. With slow precision, he pressed it against the boy's forehead. Saburo stirred but did not wake. "He is young," Goro said softly. "His body fights harder than his mind knows." Outside, the milk still soaked the ground in a misshapen bloom. Guards walked past it without care. One kicked an empty cup aside. Inside the mess tent, an officer signed a report. Incident: none. Milk delivery: complete. Morale: steady. That night, the barracks were quieter than usual. Men lay awake on their cots, some facing the ceiling, others curled to one side, eyes open. Prayers rose, but they were not for healing. They were for understanding. Prayers that Saburo's body would not betray their distrust, that the price of hunger would not be paid in shame. Jinro Fushida sat in the far corner, clutching his journal but writing nothing. His knuckles were white around the spine. He had seen Saburo kneeling in the milk. He had seen the look on the boy's face, a look of surrender disguised as thirst. What choice did he have? Jinro whispered to himself. The body speaks louder than fear. From his cot near the window, Goro watched the moon drift between clouds like a slow apology. He didn't believe the milk had been poisoned. Not anymore. But belief, he knew, wasn't the same as truth. Truth came with proof, and proof was often found in scars. Saburo moaned and twisted in sleep, murmuring fragmented phrases, names, numbers, perhaps memories of a place before war and heat and barrels of milk. Goro reached out again and dampened the cloth. Why would they poison a boy too weak to raise his fist? He asked no one, voice quiet as ash. When fear takes root, even kindness begins to rot. The moment Major Franklin Denton stepped back through the gates of Camp Millenworth, he sensed something had changed. It was subtle at first, more silence than sound. Prisoners moved in organized lines to the mess hall and drills, but they no longer glanced toward the guards with even fleeting curiosity. They looked through them, past them. Denton caught sight of the milk barrels stationed at the far edge of the yard, capped and clean, gleaming faintly under the early morning light. Not a drop missing, not a stain on the lid. He paused. A young corporal escorted him toward the administrative barracks, the gravel crunching under their boots. "Director Lyman is waiting in his office, sir," the corporal offered briskly, but Denton didn't move. "Has the milk been distributed?" The corporal hesitated. "It's available." "Twice a week, as ordered. That wasn't my question." The man faltered, eyes shifting toward the barrels. "Sir, the prisoners, they don't touch it." Some of the guards started calling it Emperor's Tears. Denton turned without a word and entered the office building, his face unreadable. Inside, Director Edward Lyman rose from behind a desk cluttered with file folders, a radio set humming faintly behind him. He extended a hand. "Major Denton, welcome back. You'll find things running smoother than ever." Denton accepted the handshake but didn't sit. His eyes scanned the walls, photos of neat formations, a pinned schedule of food rotation, and a printed copy of the War Department's Prisoner Morale Directive. "I hear the milk isn't being consumed," Denton said plainly. Lyman blinked, smiled stiffly, and gestured toward the chair. "Just nerves. They're adjusting. Cultural quirks. One week they won't eat bread, the next they ask for seconds. I've seen 3 barrels untouched in the yard." "Well, perhaps the guards haven't." "Don't," Denton interrupted, his voice soft but hard-edged. "I know what unspoken resistance looks like. These men are starving in more ways than one, and it's not from lack of food." Lyman leaned back in his chair, exhaling with exaggerated calm. "Major, with all due respect, we're not psychologists. We follow logistics. We provide what's required. But do you see them?" Denton asked, his voice rising. "There's a silence in this camp that feels rehearsed. Controlled. That's not order, that's fear. And fear doesn't nourish." For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Lyman gave a small shrug. "If there's a formal concern, Major, feel free to report it. I'll make sure the paperwork reaches the proper channels." Denton nodded slowly. "I'll do just that." He returned to his assigned desk, a small room off the camp's western wing, and sat down heavily. The air smelled faintly of dust and gun oil. Outside the frosted window, he saw prisoners walking single file to their bunkhouses, each man exactly 1 pace behind the other. No variation, no noise. Denton picked up a pen and began writing. "Confidential internal review. Camp Millenworth displays textbook discipline, but an underlying psychological strain may be affecting prisoner health. Multiple sources confirm food refusal patterns, especially regarding milk. Cultural misalignment may be deeper than previously assessed. Recommend review by religious or cultural liaison. Possibly initiate multilingual engagement or morale review team. Immediate attention advised, Major Franklin Denton, Red Cross Liaison Division." He signed the bottom, folded the paper, and slipped it into a plain envelope. On the front, he scrawled, "To Colonel J. Marrow, Intercamp Oversight, Red Cross West Region." Down the hall, he passed a civilian clerk bent over a logistics manifest. "Need this sent with the outbound pouch," Denton said, handing over the envelope. The clerk nodded absent-mindedly, sliding the envelope into a stack already teetering off the edge of his desk. A phone rang somewhere behind him. A voice barked about missing blankets and a fuel order delay. A requisition form spilled to the floor. The clerk knelt to retrieve it, bumping the stack of outgoing mail and the envelope into the open drawer below. The drawer was closed seconds later, and the clerk never noticed the letter hadn't gone out. That night, in Barracks 3, Corporal Jinro Fushida lit the last of the matchsticks and scribbled into his own journal by faint yellow light. The page trembled slightly beneath his fingers. "We are fed. We are clothed, but we are not understood. What use is nourishment when our minds are starving?" A wind howled outside, and a hinge creaked somewhere in the dark. Jinro paused to listen but heard nothing more. Across the room, Goro Sakamoto lay still on his cot, eyes open, hands folded over his chest like stone. At the administration office, Lyman reviewed a new shipment order from headquarters. A typed note at the bottom read, "Milk program deemed effective. Expand rations to twice weekly. All camps. No recorded incidents." He signed the form with a quiet grunt and filed it in the metal cabinet. Not far from him, in a drawer left unmarked and rarely opened, Denton's letter lay buried beneath surplus meal reports and outdated shoe inventories. Somewhere between the words "incident" and "success," truth had found no category. In the space between 2 languages, truth often gets shelved. The hiss of frost against the barracks wall was the first sign. Then came the silence. No rattle of pipes, no hum of warmth creeping through the thin vents. Just cold, brutal, steady, creeping like a tide across the floorboards. Lieutenant Goro Sakamoto awoke before dawn. His breath left clouds in the air. Around him, the other men were still curled under coarse blankets, their bodies huddled like bones trying to remember flesh. The wooden walls of Barracks 9, already weathered by months of Utah wind, now groaned under winter's weight. Outside, snow had formed a white crust across the parade ground. Within the hour, word spread. The central boiler had failed. A guard, young, red-cheeked, unsure, stepped into the barracks to confirm it. "Kitchen's behind, too. Generator's slow," he mumbled before vanishing back into the hallway. No further explanation was offered. None needed. The prisoners were left in their silence. By noon, the hunger gnawed. The promised morning rations had yet to arrive, and the men's breath now hung in mist between their lips. Goro's hands trembled, not from fear, but from the numbing cold. Even pride was slower in this temperature. Then came the sound of footsteps, boots scraping over the wooden corridor, and the faint clatter of metal. A group of guards appeared with tin trays, not of food, but of milk. Steam rose gently from metal ladles dipped into dented canisters, no longer the towering barrels marked with English lettering, but modest pots warmed directly in the kitchen. One guard, Sergeant Albie Wren, spoke up without meeting anyone's eyes. "Hot milk," he said. "We're offering it." From the stove. There was no sneer in his tone, no sarcasm, but there was no apology either. The prisoners didn't move. They stared, unmoving, a collective silence thick with months of suspicion and the recent memory of Saburo's collapse. Every cup held out was like a test, not of safety, but of conviction. Private Saburo Minami, now thinner but upright, stepped forward. He didn't say a word. His boots scuffed softly across the floorboards. His cheeks were pale, but there was something hard behind his eyes, a hunger not just for warmth, but for truth. Goro made no motion to stop him. Saburo reached for a tin cup, his hands shaking. The milk sloshed gently as he raised it. The guards tensed. So did the men behind him. But Saburo did not hesitate. He drank. One sip, then another. The warmth flooded down his throat, settling deep into his core like a furnace relit after months of ash. His shoulders slackened, not in surrender, but in relief. The guards whispered among themselves. Saburo wiped his mouth with the back of his sleeve and turned to face his fellow prisoners. His voice didn't rise above a whisper, but it carried through the frozen air. "It's just milk," he said. The silence held, taut like a rope about to snap. Then Corporal Hasegawa stepped forward, then another and another. Tin cups changed hands. Some prisoners took just a sip. Others drank fully, closing their eyes as the warmth spread through them like a thaw after war. Not all participated. Goro remained seated, watching. His fingers were interlaced tightly in his lap, as if holding in the thousand thoughts racing beneath his calm. From the far end of the corridor, Corporal Jinro Fushida watched with something unreadable in his eyes. Not quite shame, not quite hope. Something between. Later that evening, as the wind howled outside and the last of the tin cups were collected, Jinro stood. He crossed the threshold of the guard station without being summoned. Sergeant Wren looked up from his paperwork, surprised. Jinro's English, when it came, was slow but flawless. "We feared what we did not know," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But the warmth, we understand that now." Wren said nothing, nor did the other guards, but their silence wasn't cold this time. It was something gentler, something like listening. Across the camp, Director Edward Lyman watched the interaction from his office window. He did not interrupt. He did not file a report. Instead, he reached for his daily logbook and wrote a single line beneath the column marked "Noteworthy Events." Prisoners accepted kitchen ladle service. No objection recorded. Marked improvement. Milk received. He paused, Then, under his breath, he murmured, "Not policy." Poetry. He set the pen down. In the barracks that night, the boilers still hadn't been repaired, but the men slept a little easier, some with their hands cupped around bellies warmed by milk, others still unsure, but no longer alone in their fear. Outside, the snow fell heavier. Inside, something had begun to thaw. Sometimes, the body accepts what the mind is still afraid to name. The shutter clicked just as Jinro Fushida lifted his cup. The photographer had paused mid-frame, expecting another moment of staged orderliness, lined trays, silent faces, a guard standing behind a row of obedient POWs. But what he saw instead froze him. Japanese prisoners and American guards seated at the same long wooden table, their hands wrapped around identical tin cups of warm milk. No orders had been given, no words exchanged. Only the sound of wind against the mess hall's aging glass panes and the occasional creak of metal chairs breaking the silence. Jinro didn't look up when the flash went off. He kept his eyes fixed on the pale liquid, steam rising in curls. The warmth of the cup seeped into his hands, but it was not comfort he felt. It was weight, the kind that only comes when peace feels like defiance. To his left sat Private Saburo Minami, thinner than he had been weeks ago but more alert now, his gaze steady. Across from them, Corporal Dawson of the guard unit sipped quietly, his eyes flicking between the prisoners and the photographer with something like nervous respect. A faint scar traced his jawline, likely from before the war, and his grip on the cup was firm but not threatening. Jinro's mind raced. He hadn't intended to sit. When the guards had offered the warm milk during breakfast, it had felt like another test. But something in Saburo's eyes, unspoken, fragile, held him there. Saburo had nodded, barely, as if daring him to bridge the final distance. And so Jinro sat. Not because he trusted the gesture, but because he needed to understand why Saburo did. The photographer lowered his camera slowly. "Do you want me to retake that?" he asked the guard in charge, a young man named Price whose boots were still dusty from morning rounds. Price hesitated, chewing his lip. "No," he muttered, eyes narrowing. "Keep it." They said they wanted harmony, right? The moment stretched. Jinro took a cautious sip. The milk was slightly sweet, just like the barrel he had tasted in secret all those weeks ago. But this time, he did not hide it. There was no lie in his stomach, only silence that tasted of resolve. Saburo watched him, expression unreadable. Jinro gave the faintest nod, a gesture that meant, "We are still here. We are still ourselves." From a nearby bench, Lieutenant Goro Sakamoto sat wrapped in his coat, silent as ever. He had not touched his milk. He didn't need to. His eyes, half closed, lingered on Jinro, not with reproach, but with something older, deeper, as if he too understood that not all wars were fought with fists or flags. Later that afternoon, the mess hall emptied slowly. The guards filed out with fewer glances than usual. Jinro lingered, rinsing his cup at the basin, letting the hot water sting his fingers. It was not the warmth of home, but it was warmth. Back in his barracks, Jinro carefully tucked a folded paper into his journal, a draft letter to a cousin in Kyoto he would never send. He didn't need to. The words were only for him. Today, we drank together. Not because we forgot, but because remembering in silence was heavier than defiance in unity. The next morning, the photographer submitted his roll of film and logged the shots as routine. One image, labeled Shared Meal, Special Exceptions, Camp Millenworth, was filed into a cabinet in a room no one visited twice. Years passed. Jinro, now an old man with silver hair and weak knees, kept a small black-and-white photograph behind the last row of English novels on his shelf in Tokyo. His grandson, curious, asked one day, "Did you really drink it, Ji-chan? The milk from the enemy?" Jinro smiled softly, his eyes glassy with memory. He took the photograph in his hand but didn't hand it over. "Because someone had to go first," he said, voice low and steady. "Because warmth is harder to fake than peace." In the end, it was not the milk that changed us. It was the choice to drink it together. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of fear, misunderstanding, and the discovery of kindness in unexpected places. Its purpose is to entertain while reminding viewers that compassion and shared humanity can overcome even the deepest mistrust.